to the sixth lecture in our course on the modern novel. Today we will talk about the development of the modern novel. In our last lecture, you would remember we talked about, we looked a little bit in details at Robinson Crusoe as an example of one of the first novels that became very popular and established the form of the novel especially within the English society. We said that among the things that we said was that Robinson Crusoe and Daniel Defoe was a journalist, and he didn't write the novel Robinson Crusoe until he was nearly 60. But his profession was rather that of a journalist, and as a journalist he writes in simple English. His English was not, he did not write for critics or educated people, but rather he wrote for average citizens and average people who read the novels not for education or for classical art or things like that, but they read the novel simply as a form of entertainment, as a way for them to get informed about the adventures they were hearing about, because we have to remember this is a time when European explorers were crossing the world and crossing the oceans, discovering different parts of the world and establishing colonies and dealing with all sorts of new nations and peoples and having all sorts of adventures. So back home in England, people talked about, there was a lot of talk about the adventures, about the faraway places that, you know, these travelers were going to, and the strange things they were seeing and the strange people they were dealing with. So the novel emerged as a method of communication that informed people about the details of these travels. A lot of the information was exaggerated and fed the people's thirst for the exotic, for the extraordinary. So some of these novels talked about creatures with two heads, or about populations or peoples in faraway islands who were cannibals, and a lot of these were just invented stories to sell newspaper or to sell stories to people who were thirsty for this type of information. But at any rate, what this kind of writing did was to establish this form of writing. It still doesn't have a name, it's just called the novel, which, you know, comes from the Italian and the French, and nouvelle or novella, and simply means the new form of writing. That's all that the word novel means. It just means it's a new form of writing. It's not poetry, it's not epic, it's not tragedy, it's not comedy, it's prose. And it just tells stories about faraway places in simple English, without decorations and without embellishment of language. Or so what these stories did was to establish simple prose as a form of communication, and to establish a forum, in a way, a forum for large sections of the populations who before could not read tragedies or epic poetry because they were illiterate, but now, because they have some basic education and literacy, they're able to read these novellas, these short stories, these novels, and understand them and get pleasure from them. So in the 17th and 18th century, the novels like Daniel Defoe achieved a huge success, and the public of the novel increased many folds. It became bigger and bigger, and now the habit of reading novels is becoming widespread, to the point that there is, of course, there is more schools and more literacy, and people, more and more average people, are able to read and write. And of course, there is also industrial revolutions, and in the 19th century, even trains, and so it became common to see people reading novels in coffee shops, in the street, on a train, in a coach. It became common for people to read a novel as a break from their daily work. They work hard all day, and then they come home, and the best thing to do is to read a novel, just like we come home today, and many people go and sit in front of the television and, you know, catch up on like the latest episode of their favorite series, or watch a film, or, well, in the 18th and 19th century, people would come home and sit down and read a novel. Or housewives who, you know, do their work at home, to take a break, they would sit down, make a cup of tea or coffee, and sit down and read a novel. So it became very common to see young people in the street or on a train sitting and reading a novel, people sitting in coffee shops or in restaurants or in the street and just reading a novel. So it created, the novel created a huge reading public, a reading public that literature didn't have before, that classical forms of literature like the epic, like poetry, like tragedy, never had before. Tragedy, epic poetry always had a small segment of society as a public, people who were educated enough to understand them, to understand their complex language, structure, themes, ideas, and so on. Well, now the novel is producing a huge public for this form of literature. And slowly also the form of the novel starts taking many forms and shapes. So while the first novels were simple in terms of language and structure, some novels remained like that. And in fact, there's even the interesting phenomena in 18th and 19th century England of mobile libraries. There were mobile libraries. Libraries, for example, some of the bookstores today in England, like W.H. Smith, right? That's a famous bookstore in England. Well, W.H. Smith used to be a mobile library, and it traveled around the country and rented books to people for, you know, a cheap price. They would rent it, read it, and bring it back. So these mobile libraries made books available to people even in the smallest villages. You don't have to go to London to find books and libraries. There's these mobile libraries that come to you, even to your most remote village, and they would rent books to you, and you can read them and return them back for a small fee that's accessible for everybody to pay. So the novel form now evolves because there is a huge public. The novel form doesn't stay in the same form that Daniel Defoe or Stevenson leaves it. It evolves too. Some of it remains simple and accessible to the population, and a simple form of entertainment. But other forms of the novel develop in more complex and literate and learned ways. So they don't just aim for entertainment, but rather they aim for instruction. They try to explore aspects of reality that they couldn't explore otherwise, either in verse or through tragedies or so on. So the novel, because it's long, because it's an extended piece of narrative, it allows the writer and the reader and the public to explore forms of issues and concepts and parts of their existence and reality and parts of their world through writing in ways that they couldn't do through poetry and drama before. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about the development, this development that happens in the 18th and 19th centuries. This development that happens because the novel created a huge reading public, because of the widespread of literacy and the impact in the society that this created. So first of all, England is still a conservative country, and the first reaction, of course, is a reaction of condemnation. There is people, especially from the church, who come and say that this form of writing is sinful. It teaches people bad habits. It keeps them obsessed with romance and with travel, and it keeps them away from the church. So there is, of course, there is an anti-novel campaign. And according to the literature, we find that up to the 1850s, this is the middle of the 19th century, it was still common to find people who forbade their families from reading novels. So in someone's house, the father would just forbid his family from reading novels. They would forbid them from buying them, from reading them, from having them in the household. The idea of telling stories, especially fictitious stories, was still considered by some to be a sin, to be sinful and contrary to the Christian religion. But this censorship only made people more curious and more wanting to read narratives and stories. So by the 1880s, by the end of the 19th century, the prohibition was softened. That's it. There is no more softened. And as people like Anthony Trollope records in his autobiography, which he wrote in 1883, he says 50 years ago, meaning around 1830, 1840, people wouldn't let their children read novels. But he said now, in the 1880s, he says novels are read right and left, above stairs and below, in townhouses and in country parsonages, by young countesses and by farmers' daughters, by old lawyers and by young students. End of quote. So basically, we have evidence that by the 1880s, everybody in the English society was reading novels. And the prohibitions that existed in the 1850s just stopped being applied anymore, and people stopped respecting them anymore, and everybody could buy and read novels. Why did the novel become such a dominant literary form in the Victorian period? The Victorian period is from the 1830s, 1837 to be precise, I think, when Queen Victoria came to power in England, and she ruled for such a long time. She was Queen of England from 1837 to 1901. So that's nearly 64 years in which Queen Victoria was Queen of England. And it's in this period, we refer to it as the Victorian period. It's in this period that the novel became a dominant literary form. Neither poetry nor drama could match its popularity or match its audience. Well, why did the novel become so dominant and popular in the Victorian period? Very simply, the audience for the novel grew enormously during the 19th century. Of course, the spread of literacy and all the other factors that we mentioned before. This growth in the audience of the novel was due primarily to economic factors. First of all, we have the growth of cities. We have huge megalopolis. You know, London is becoming a gigantic city, and so is France and Paris, and you know, there's huge, big European cities that are growing and becoming, and they provide bigger markets for that before poetry and tragedy never had before. So the growth of cities provides bigger markets, bigger audiences, bigger readers, large numbers of people who are newly educated, new schools, and so on and so forth. Another factor is the development of overseas readership in the colonies. So of course, you have to remember that there's a lot of English people who live in the English colonies, whether in North America, in South America, in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand, in South Africa. And these English people who live overseas, of course, they keep abreast of the culture of their motherland, right? So they import books and new magazines and new journals and new books and new novels wherever they are, and they read them, whether in America or New Zealand. So this also allowed the audience of the novel to expand and become bigger, and allowed the novel to reach bigger and bigger audiences. Another important factor is cheaper production costs. The production of novels is becoming cheaper, both in terms of for papers. Paper is cheap now, so to produce a book, to publish a novel, it's very cheap now because paper is cheap. And also the print process, the machines have become cheap, and the cost of operating these machines is now cheaper. So the production cost of the novel is now cheap, which allows publishers and booksellers to sell their books at a cheaper price, and it makes it affordable for average English people. There is also another important factor. It's the improvement in distribution networks. Distribution networks, of course, we have print factories where books are published, and then these books can be distributed across the country. The development of distribution networks, trains, coaches, right, that distribute this published material all over the country. So these improved, and in this way the novel managed to reach audiences in remote places all over Europe, all over England, all over the UK, all over the colonies, and in fact all over the world. Finally, there is also another important factor. It's the improvement in the advertising and promotion work. So even these people who sell novels have improved their advertisement and have managed now to send their message, to broadcast their message to larger segments of societies, and manage to sell more books and create bigger audiences. You add to that, of course, the spread of literacy, the increase in wealth, so that, you know, average families now, it's more possible for an average family to work hard and become part of the middle class, increase their income. And with the increase of income, of course, there is leisure time, a time in which a person can have some time off for pleasure. And among the things people do for pleasure is read a novel. Case in point, one of the characters if we look at the novels of the period, the novels also talks about novels. Many novels talk about novels, and they give us an idea about the culture of the novels that was spread at the time in England. So in a novel by Mary Braddon called The Doctor's Wife, it was written in 1864, it describes the novel in this way. The character says, "A novel is a splendid thing after a hard day's work, a sharp, practical tussle with the real world." So the novel, according to this character, from this novel we understand that there were people in the English society in the 1860s who saw the novel as a splendid thing after a hard day's work. They work hard all day. When they come home for entertainment, to relax, they read a novel. A novel is a splendid thing after a hard day's work, a sharp, practical tussle with the real world. Reading fiction is a way of relaxing or winding down after a day of hard work for both men working outside and for women who at this point still work inside the house. At this point in England, women are still mostly housewives doing work at home, right? But both men and women use the novel as a form of relaxation and a form of winding down after a hard day's work. Novel writers were told, in the Saturday Review, for example, in 1887, this is a literary journal that also gives us an idea about how people related to novels. So the Saturday Review gave advice to novel writers in 1887, and the journal told novel writers that the average reader of the novels is not a critical person, right? This was an advice to novel writers, and it basically told them, hey, look, pay attention that the people who are reading your novels, they're not critical persons, they're not well-educated people, that he or she, the readers, that they care little for art's sake. They're not reading these novels to appreciate the art. They have no fixed ideas about the duties and responsibilities of an author. They don't care about the author or the duties or the responsibilities of the author. The journal said that all the reader asks is that he may be amused and interested without taxing his own brains, right? This is all the reader of the novel demands. They're not interested in the arts, they're not interested in the duties and the responsibilities of the author. All they want, all they ask is that they may be amused and interested without taxing his own brains. Don't make him work hard. Just give him an entertaining story that they can read and enjoy, and that's it. Eventually, a distinction developed between novels that were intellectually, psychologically, and aesthetically demanding, right? Novels that were what we call today a serious novel, where one reads it, we read them to appreciate the art, to appreciate the aesthetics, to appreciate the issues being discussed, to appreciate the craft of the author, the ideas of the author. These are serious works that an average person would find hard to read without some training. So eventually, quickly, a distinction started being made between novels that were read simply for escapism, simply to escape, just for some entertainment, and novels that were intellectually, psychologically, and philosophically serious and demanding from the reader. So in the final decades of the Victorian era, a firm division was established between the artist or the serious novelist and the masses of readers. Because the masses of readers can read, but they can only read for amusement. So they read easy books, easy to read books for entertainment. But the serious novelist, the serious artist, who is serious about their work, they write novels that are more complex and complicated, and that only an educated elite can engage and read and understand. One of the controversies that created this division was the issue of the happy ending. Until the end of the 19th century, there was huge demand on novel writers to make their novels have a happy ending, right? If you're a novel, your publisher, your audience, your readers, your friends, everybody wants a happy ending, right? Dickens, for example, Charles Dickens, is known to have changed the ending of some of his novels to please the reader with a happy ending. Others, like George Eliot, for example, is known to have opposed the idea of a happy ending. George Eliot demanded that the readers should curb, should stop, should control their desire for fiction to provide the exceptional and romantic. Basically what she means is that the reader should educate himself and control their desire to make fiction, to make novels, provide the exceptional and romantic, you know, fairy tales, things that are exceptional and strange and exotic, right? She wanted the reader to learn, to educate himself or herself about the importance of the ordinary. Ordinary life, ordinary scenes, ordinary events, ordinary people, things that are around us, so closely around us that we fail to notice them. And it takes a novelist with a very good eye to notice them, to express them, to depict them, and present them to us in a way that would make us see them. These are ordinary things. Poverty, for example, despair, violence, all sorts of things that are around us. So George Eliot refused the idea of the happy ending and encouraged the reader to control their desire for exotic stories, for stories about exceptional events, and wanted the reader to educate themselves to appreciate the importance of the ordinary, the simple, everyday events. So the issue of happy ending, of course, it's not just about happy ending, it's essentially a question about the place of romance in the novel. We have to remember that the novel emerged out of romance literature. Romance literature, which was very popular in the medieval period. It was made popular by French poets. They were called les troubadours, right? And in the medieval period, in the Middle Ages, they made romance literature very famous. And it's from romance literature that the novel developed. Well, romance, it's always a question of an exceptional love story with a happy ending, right? So, but romance also has a history of providing escapism only. It's not educational, it's not particularly enlightening, it does not present any serious insights into social, intellectual, psychological, philosophical, linguistic, artistic issues. Romance doesn't. Romance is simply a form of escapism. It's a form of entertainment that allows the reader to escape their reality and lose themselves in a romantic story, right? So, when the novel became popular and created a huge audience, a lot of this audience, the large majority of this audience, were not very well educated people, and they just wanted some escapism. They just wanted some entertainment. But there were novelists who were serious about their work and did not want to keep writing romances and to restrict the novel within the framework of the romance. So John Roscoe, for example, in his Sesame and Lilies, written in 1865, John Roscoe writes, he said, the best romance becomes dangerous. There's a danger in romance. Why is there a danger in romance? He says, well, if by its excitement it renders the ordinary course of a life uninteresting, right? Because there is excitement in the romance, that the reader becomes just curious for more excitement and extraordinary stories that the reader becomes unexcited, uninterested about the ordinary course of a life. The ordinary course of a life for the reader is not interesting, not important. They want to escape into a romance that's exceptional, that's strange, that's powerful, that's intense, and so on. Well, these novelists, especially with the development of realism, which will be the topic of our next lecture, these novelists with the development of realism, they are discovering natural things. They are discovering reality. They are discovering ordinary life, the complexities in ordinary life, the difficulties of ordinary life, the pleasures of ordinary life, the amazing complexities of this ordinary life. So he says the best romance becomes dangerous, this is John Ruskin, if by its excitement it renders the ordinary course of a life uninteresting and increases the morbid thirst for useless acquaintances with scenes in which we shall never be called upon to act. Of course, when we read a romance, it's so unusual. I mean, romances are about a prince and a princess. Well, most of us are not princes and princesses. Most of us don't know princes and princesses. Most of us, these are stories that will never apply to us, right? We can only dream about them, right? These novelists in the 19th century wanted readers to read stories about them in which they feel that these are scenes that come from their own lives, from their own realities, from their own societies, scenes in which they exist, that relate to them, about people that they know, about relatives, about friends. And by reading about them in this way, it allows them to think about their own life and the events in their own life, right? So at this point in the late 19th century and early 20th century, we get to the point where the novel, in a way, there is a division that happens between popular novels that are simply meant for entertainment and serious novels that have developed enough material and enough body of work and enough writers to try to produce serious literature that attempts to explore reality in ways that poetry, drama could never do before. I hope this has been useful, and thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lecture. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala wa barakatuh. طيب. Next one.